Welcome everybody to our session on the Second World War and how it's still unveiling secrets and untold stories. 80 years on, more than 80 years on since its end, we're still fascinated by what happened and how it reshaped the world that we live in at the cost of so much destruction and so many lives. Today we have three amazing historians and writers joining us. Anne Sebba is going to be talking about her book, The Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz. Anne is an acclaimed writer on the Second World War. Some of you may know her wonderful book, The Parisians, about Paris under occupation. We have Tim Bouverieand, author of Allies at War, a more broader spectrum book looking at the whole history of the Second World War and the tumultuous, difficult, sometimes treacherous, complicated relationship between the Allied leaders. Tim's also the author of Appeasing Hitler, which is a study of appeasement, very topical and apposite for our site today, as some of that indeed took place in this house, at the Cliveden House, known as the home of the Cliveden set, a history that's still contested and many versions about it still abound, depending on one's ideological persuasion, perhaps. But Tim's book is a very good, thorough and objective examination of that phenomena. And finally, last but not least, we have Jonathan Freedland, author of Traitor's Circle, a study of a group of German resistors and their valiant efforts to stand against the Nazis during the Third Reich and during the Second World War. Jonathan, also another expert on the Second World War, author of a book about the two prisoners who escaped from Auschwitz called The Escape Artist, about Rudolf Verber and Alfred Wetzler, who wrote the Auschwitz Protocol, which was the first detailed document to bring to the world the reality of what was happening in the camp. So we're going to start by each author, and then me. I will tell you a little bit about my book as well, The Last Days of Budapest. Talking about, I've asked them, we've gone a bit BuzzFeed, and I said, give us the three things from your books, which are all obviously complex, intricate, well-argued narratives, but what are the three things that most surprised you as authors when you were writing your books and researching your book? Because we should always be a bit surprised by the things we found out. I was quite amazed by some of the things I found out from my book, but let's start with Anne.
Thank you very much, Adam, for that nice introduction. Well, because you have given us a moment's warning as to the question you were going to ask.
Yeah, I didn't want to drop you in it. Yeah.
I'm going to start by what other people think is the most surprising, that there was music in an extermination camp. Well, I don't actually think that's surprising. Now, that may be because I've had a few years thinking about it, but music, or should I say a perversion of music as a Nazi tool of torture. So it's not real beautiful music, but music was at the core of the whole Nazi project from 1933 onwards. They made prisoners march while they were singing, and it may have been the Horst Wessel lead, but singing. And they had loudspeakers in some of the earliest camps, blaring loud music to prevent sleeping. So these orchestras were used to make the prisoners who weren't being exterminated immediately march faster as they went out to work. So the more I've thought about this story, music is not only integral to the Nazi belief that they were the originators of great music and opera, but it's perverted here. So I don't feel that having music per se is extraordinary. I think what I do find extraordinary is the amazing desire to live, the tenacity, resilience of the human spirit. So this orchestra comprised about 45, by some accounts 48 women and girls. Some of these were teenagers who'd maybe had a couple of years playing the recorder or the piccolo in school. They weren't musicians. And what every survivor of the camp tells you is you can't imagine unless you were there. So let's try. Try imagining feeling really hungry to the point of starving, freezing to the point where you can't work your fingers, desperately fearful that at any point you'd be shot. So for me, the real surprise is that these women and girls, having seen the worst and the most bestial that human nature had to offer, nonetheless wanted to live. The tenacity they showed in hope, and hope in the human spirit. So that's my number 2. My number 3, I think, the real shock, and I had to question myself actually as to whether I wrote about this, but I'm a historian, my duty is to the truth, so ultimately the truth trumps or rises above, shall we say, everything else. So anti-Semitism within this music block was a shock because it had to be half Christian, half Jewish. The Nazis insisted on that. And these Polish women, who were the first people in the camp, were arrested because they were resistors to the Nazis. Many of them had been in the Polish Home Army. Many of them had actually offered their homes as a safe house to Jews. They thought they were good people opposed to everything that the Nazis stood for. But when they were in this music block of about 60 people, they couldn't resist accusing the Jews of, quote unquote, seeing anti-Semitism everywhere, and that was in Auschwitz. The arguments were mostly about food because the Polish women were allowed food parcels, the Jews weren't and didn't have anyone to send them. So the idea that there was anti-Semitism within the orchestra was a shock, but I felt I had to write about it. And I think my final surprise is that the camps really, if we're looking at historiography and what we'll look at in the future, I think history will be less focused on the concentration camps, which have occupied the last 80 years as a completely appalling aspect of human nature. But what I realized is actually how late the killings in the camps were relatively to the earlier shooting in mass graves and pits that went on earlier. And I think that's the correction that as historians in the future will start to look at, that the camps were literally the final solution when the Nazis discovered the way of killing Jews en masse.
Thank you. Let me just ask you quickly, why the music? Why did they have music?
Oh, well...
Why was it important to them?
Two reasons. Mostly to disguise the fact that it was an extermination camp, to make it look like a military camp if VIPs came. They would make the women, and the men, of course, because the women's orchestra came after the men's orchestras, to make them march in step, to look as if they were something to do with military, always to put your right foot forward, and if you didn't and you put your left foot forward, you'd get a Nazi kick and you might be kicked into the ditch and then you might not survive. And to aid the Nazi mania for counting, so they could count them 5, 10, 15, 20, and roughly have some idea of how many people were there. But I think it was used as a perversion to torture them, but those were the principal reasons.
Okay, thank you. Tim?
Well, thank you, Adam, very much. The three things which consistently struck me during the course of my research are quite broad themes, but they're very much the themes that are at the centre of this book about the Second World War. And the first one is the extent to which politics drove military decisions. And I think that's quite striking. We often think of military expediency being the cardinal impetus behind these great battles. But politics was as important, if not more important, to certain critical decisions. And I'll just give you one example which links to what was one of, I thought, the most exciting documentary discoveries I made in the course of research. On the 3rd of July 1940, the British enjoyed their first victory of the Second World War. Unfortunately, it was not against the Germans, but against the French. This was the shelling of the French Navy off the North African coast at Mers el Kabir. And there were very legitimate military reasons for this, and there was a negotiation which could have allowed the French to scuttle their ships themselves or to sail them to North America. But apart from the military reasons were also political ones, above all the determination to show an isolationist United States that this country was going to survive, and survive no matter what, and that therefore America should aid this country. Most American aid to Britain did not come through until quite late on in 1940. But it had never ever been suggested before that the British had consulted with the American government before they opened fire on the French fleet and killed 1,300 French sailors.
1,300?
1,300 French sailors. But I was in the Franklin Roosevelt Presidential Archives in upstate New York, and I came across a one-line telegram from the British ambassador to FDR the day after the bombardment, which, for whatever reason, had either not been read or not been published before. And it simply said, "Mr. President, you will see that Winston Churchill has taken the action with regard to the French fleet, which you and I discussed, and you approved." And I think this is significant. Similarly, when one looks at the reasons for British intervention in Greece, another disastrous military escapade, another disastrous military evacuation, following the evacuations from Norway, from France, twice. This is done for political reasons, mainly to do with the United States. The other consistent theme, which surprised me just by its depth, I expected there to be Anglo-American friction, but the extent of American animosity towards the British because of the empire, because of the system of tariffs that protected the British Empire. In those days, the Americans were very anti-tariffs, and it was a consistent US war aim to dismantle the tariffs that protected the British Empire. Opinion polls in the United States before the Battle of Britain ranked the British Isles 6th among the list of nations fighting in the war which Americans had most sympathy with. Finland, France, Poland, nationalist China, all of these countries came first. When the Australian minister in Washington asked the leading isolationist senator, Senator Vandenberg from Michigan, how he saw the war following a German victory. This is in the summer of 1940 when Britain and her empire are alone. This leading statesman, not a hillbilly, not a stupid man by any stretch of the imagination, replied, "It would be unfortunate, but not catastrophic. The population of the British Isles could always be transferred to Canada." And thereafter, at every stage of the game, the extent to which the US is looking towards its own post-war interests, the extent to which it is denuding Britain of her gold reserves, of her dollar reserves, an absolutely extraordinary moment where British, Canadian, and Free French scientists are cut out of the Manhattan Project for nearly a year because the Americans, having been given a huge amount of technical aid by the British, the Free French, and the Canadians, are now so far in the lead that they think that they will benefit from this technology. And why share this technology, which has great commercial potential as well as military diplomatic potential? And I still find it very hard to get my head around this, because although the Allies didn't know the extent of Soviet espionage in the Manhattan Project, they did know that Hitler was building an atomic weapon. And by that stage, 1943, 1944, the only way that Hitler could have still won the Second World War was if he had got the bomb before the West. And delaying the completion of the atomic bomb for appallingly narrow, parochial, commercial, Aravistic reasons I find amazing. And it took considerable diplomacy by Churchill to get the British and the Canadians reinstated. And finally, I think the combination of extraordinary naivety on the one hand and rank cynicism on the other that both Churchill and Roosevelt displayed in their handling of Joseph Stalin and their mishandling of Joseph Stalin is a paradox which is very meaty and complex and significant to unpack. The extent to which at times these two highly capable, highly charming politicians and statesmen convinced themselves that they were getting to terms with Stalin. Churchill returns from the Yalta Conference and says, poor Neville Chamberlain thought he could trust Hitler, but I think that I'm right about Stalin. And yet, at the same time, moments of clarity, and the private moments of Roosevelt's clarity, when he, for instance, bans the British from negotiating a treaty with the Soviets in 1942, which will allow the Soviets to have sovereignty over the Baltic states, which were grabbed by the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939. Roosevelt vetoes this. He says it's appalling. It's against all our principles for which we are fighting. It's against self-determination. This is what the United States stands for. But privately, he tells the Soviet ambassador, Maxim Litvinov, that the United States has no problem with the Soviet Union moving its frontiers considerably to the westwards. He just can't say so publicly for political reasons. So that tension between great hopes for a future relationship with the Eastern Bloc and astonishing naivety about the powers of personal diplomacy fascinates me, and I think it's something which has relevance today as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. Jonathan.
Thank you. So this book is, as you heard from Adam, it's about a group of Germans, very elite aristocratic Germans, who were in different ways defying Hitler and the Nazi regime, in ways large and small. And they gather for a tea party in September 1943. They do not know that sitting among them, around the table, is someone they believe is one of their own, a kindred spirit, but who is in fact about to betray all the rest to the Gestapo. So that is the sort of story. The three surprises to me. The first one, in a way, is that a group like this existed at all. I opened the book by saying something very personal, which is that I grew up in a house where nothing German was allowed. There were no German household appliances, no Siemens dishwasher. There was no Volkswagen or Audi parked outside. And the edict came from my late mother, who had lost her own mother when my mother, was 8 years old, the very last V-2 rocket of the war, of the Blitz, to land on London, killed my grandmother.
It landed in the East End, didn't it?
And that was in the East End of London. It's a whole story in itself. There were 133 people killed that day on one building, and 120 of them were Jews in the East End of London. And my mother there carried around with her, I always say she was not a Holocaust survivor, but she felt the breath of the Shoah on her neck. And she had an attitude which I have, since this book has been published, discovered is quite commonplace, which was that the Germans were an entirely guilty nation, that every last German was implicated, and therefore we should boycott their products. And that was the sense that I grew up with as a child. What I discovered in this book is that, according to one Allied investigator, an American war crimes investigator, after 1945, as many as 3 million Germans were detained, arrested, imprisoned for crimes of dissent, sometimes no more than a critical remark. It's not on itself, it means only 5% or so of
But still
Germans.
a huge number, though, isn't it? It's
Well,
not
so it depends how you play it.
20,000.
So
Yeah.
it's on the one level, it is only 5%, 95% of Germans complied and fell in line, but 3 million is not nothing. And this book focuses in a way on a group of about 10 of that 3 million. But to me, that was a big thing that I hadn't previously absorbed. I mean, we know about the Valkyrie plot, and we know perhaps about the White Rose movement, Sophie Scholl, but the idea that there were 3 million did come as a surprise to me, especially given my upbringing. So that was one big surprise. The second one was I always knew, incidentally, in writing this book, that there would have to be, because I always pictured that the way to tell this story would be really as a kind of whodunit, that you had this sort of drawing room set, the 2 countesses, not one, in this group. There was an ambassador's widow and a doctor and a reforming headmistress. There was a former model. This group around the table, and I thought the way to write this is a kind of Agatha Christie style whodunit, where you'll be thinking, is it her or maybe it's him? You know? as you're reading it, and I knew that I would need a detective in this story. And what I didn't know is that the detective in real life who did hunt down this group was a figure who I think has been sort of missed a bit by history. His name was Leo Lange. He was a Gestapo detective in 1943, but he had previously been one of the central figures.
A hideous character.
Say again?
A hideous character.
Hideous character, I think so too, I agree. But a really central figure in the final solution, in that phase that Anne is talking about. To cut a long story short, he was deployed into Poland, and he is tasked with experimenting with a new method of killing, namely gas. And he sets up what are at first these mobile vans that go around the Polish countryside, rounding up psychiatric patients and those the Nazis brand mentally defective. But he refines the idea until eventually the vans are not mobile anymore, and they are fixed, static rooms, in effect, in a place called Chelmno, which is in effect the first death camp, and he is the first commandant of that death camp. Jews are herded into the back of these what were originally vans and are gassed to death. It makes him an absolutely pivotal figure in the Nazi killing of 6 million Jews.
What happened to him?
Well, you have to read the book for that.
Good answer.
So you have to see what happens to him. But the third surprise is the question that runs through the whole book, and the reason why, in a way, I wanted to write it, and why I think it has a current resonance in some ways, is a question I think we do all ask ourselves when we ever look at this period that we're all four of us talking about today, is what would I have done? And underneath that is usually an assumption that, well, obviously I would have been in the resistance and I would have been one of the good guys. No way would I have gone along with this. The sobering fact is 95% did not resist and they went along with it. So it requires a great deal of sort of arrogance to say, well, I would have been one of the 5%. But I think we are all fascinated by what is it that explains who those 5% are, what kind of people. So just in a very quick nutshell about that, two things I discovered, both of which I wouldn't have anticipated, I wouldn't necessarily have guessed. First one is a sort of big one, the second one is a sort of quirky, smaller point. The big point is that the people in this story who managed to rebel, it wasn't always a coincidence that they were from these very aristocratic elite backgrounds. The key thing to equip somebody to be strong enough to stand up to, the Gestapo people at the door was a belief that the Third Reich was not the highest authority that you could imagine, that you believed that there was an authority above Adolf Hitler. In this case, several of them were Christian, committed Christians, who believed, yes, Adolf Hitler's giving me this order, but I obey a higher order from Jesus Christ. And that was a common thread for several of these people. It gave them a kind of inner confidence. Others drew confidence, frankly, from their class, that they believed they were from a sort of aristocratic heritage that was 1,000 years old, and that often their view in a nutshell was that Hitler was some kind of horrible little oik who would sort of come and go, but their families and their inheritance was stronger and enduring. And that gave them a kind of confidence to think, this too will pass, and there are higher values that I'm obedient to. That's one common element of a lot of the people in this story, not the betrayer, who we're not going to reveal. The other thing, which is a smaller observation, I say smaller simply because the data set is smaller, but several of the key people, in fact a majority of the people at that Tea Party were women. And they were women who had the courage and strength to stand up to the Nazis. Now, what made that possible? And I think before writing this, I would have thought, well, probably they had very strong mothers who were kind of role models to them. It turns out, and I don't know how scientific this is, that all of the women in this book had very strong fathers. And not just strong fathers, they had very strong relationships with their fathers. The fathers raised these women, even when they were very young, when they were little girls, to believe they were the equal of any boy. And there was nothing a boy could do that they couldn't do. There was nothing a man could do that they couldn't do. They have that in common, these relationships with these very strong father figures. And somehow that gave them a confidence, and in the era of the Third Reich, that confidence hardened into courage. And I wouldn't have guessed that. It was a surprise to me and a fascinating one. And that perhaps will do as my 3 surprises from the traitors.
Thank you. Oh, that's 3 really, really interesting contributions. I'll just talk a little bit about my own book, The Last Days of Budapest, which is the first account of the history of the city during the Second World War. It tells the story from 39 to 45. The book, although it's supposed to be a history of the Second World War, actually starts in 1916, but does go very rapidly up to 1939. The 3 things that really surprised me, and that's someone, I've been a foreign correspondent covering Hungary and Central Europe for more than 25 years, so I thought I knew a fair bit about it. Number 1 was that we, Britain, had an embassy, a fully functioning embassy in Budapest until April 1941. We had full diplomatic relations with Hungary, even though Hungary was also fully paid up member of the Axis with Japan, Italy and Nazi Germany. We weren't actually at war with Hungary. And in that embassy was a substantial section of the Special Operations Executive, the people that we think of more often as people being dropped by parachute into occupied France, the very brave, many of them women actually, operatives who went on to join the resistance and operate radio sets and things. Well, Britain had that in Hungary, but they were going in and out of Poland. One of the most key, most famous operatives of the SOE, some of you may have heard of her, was a woman called Christina Skarbek, later changed her name to Christine Glanville. She was in and out of Budapest, in and out of Nazi-occupied Poland. She was a Polish woman herself. Her mother was Jewish, her father was a sort of dissolute aristocrat. But there was much more than that going on, because the British embassy, actually it was a legation, but in functional terms it was an embassy, was running a massive rescue operation in and out of Poland, channeling literally tens of thousands of Polish soldiers into Hungary, because at that time Slovakia, if you look on a map now, there's no border, Slovakia is there, but at that time a bit of Slovakia had been reabsorbed by Hungary and the rest had been taken over by Germany. So there was a Hungarian-Polish border. Tens of thousands of Polish soldiers were brought down into Hungary and then taken west to join the Free Forces or south into Yugoslavia. And one of the key people in that was a Hungarian countess. It's always the countesses, isn't it? You have 2 countesses. Yeah. I have 2 as well, actually. Countess Clara Androssy, who later married another Hungarian aristocrat and actually became raised to a princess. She became Princess Kaja Odescalchi. The Androssy is one of the most storied, famous families in Hungary. If any of you, who's here has been to Budapest? Lots of you. So I'm sure you've been on Androssy Way, that lovely, huge street that goes from downtown Budapest up to Hero Square. That's named for the Androssy family, and she was the daughter of that family. She turned the Androssy Palace, which is still there now. If you go to Budapest, cross the Chain Bridge, it's like the second or there's the third building on the right, a big green palace, and there's a little plaque outside it in Hungarian and Polish. She turned it into a huge resistance centre, working with the British Embassy, bringing all these Polish soldiers and also several thousand Polish Jewish refugees as well into Hungary. And that carried on until, well, in April 1941, the Germans transited through Hungary on their way to invade Yugoslavia, at which point the British ambassador Owen O'Malley, who wrote a very interesting memoir, went off to see Admiral Horthy, the Hungarian leader, and said, "Sir, you are a jackal preying on the corpse of Yugoslavia, and your country will pay the price for this after the war, and we are severing relations with you." And they'd been pretty friendly before that, actually. So that was the end of that. But the Polish rescue operation continued at a lower level until March 1944, when the Germans invaded. One of the first places they went to was the Androssy Palace, smashed the doors down at 6 in the morning, shot everyone inside. That was unfortunately the end of the Polish rescue operation. But there is a small plaque outside on the other side, on Fur Street, the main street on the Buda side, commemorating that. But I read this and I think, this is unbelievable. I never heard anything about this ever. In Britain, in Hungary, they barely talk about it. A few Hungarian historians have looked at it. and I was happy to draw on their work and recognise it. But who knew that Britain was running a rescue operation for tens of thousands of Polish soldiers in 1939, right through to spring 1941? No, I've never met anyone that's heard of that. So that was the first thing. Second thing was, the one reason they were doing it, leads into the second thing, was that Hungary always had one eye on the West. So Horthy, Admiral Horthy, he's often described erroneously as a fascist or a Nazi. He was neither. He was a conservative, authoritarian nationalist, but he hated Hitler. Whenever he met him, he used to wear white gloves so he wouldn't have to wear, his skin would not have to touch Hitler's skin. So he wanted, after a while, especially after Hungary did join the war in the summer of 41 and took part in Operation Barbarossa, losing 200,000 soldiers in a week on one front, 100,000 killed, the rest wounded or taken prisoner. He wanted to change sides, and Hungary actually, in September 1943, did a deal of a diplomat called Laszlo Veres went out naturally to Istanbul, where he was taken on to the yacht of the British ambassador by two SOE operatives at night, writes a very vivid account of this, and they thrashed out the terms by which Hungary would change sides. But one of those terms, which actually loops into Tim's book, was that the Hungarians hoped that the Brits and the Americans would land in Yugoslavia, come up the Dalmatian coast into Slovenia, and fight their way into Hungary, because they couldn't really change sides and then nothing happens, because they'll immediately get invaded. So, although they were going to get invaded anyway, so it would have been better to change sides and at least try. But they didn't, and Horthy could not make the jump. But I hadn't realised that it was so far advanced. And there was already lots of kind of things happening. For example, Allied bombers on the way to bomb Romania, which was fighting with the Germans as well. When they flew over Hungary, they would never be shot at. And they sometimes even were allowed to regroup in Hungarian airspace and then continue their mission to bomb Romania. So there was a lot of ambiguity there, which I thought was really fascinating. And the third thing was the extent of the Jewish and Zionist resistance groups during 1944, after the Nazis invaded. Especially in Budapest, very extensive resistance. But because it was resistance based around safe houses, manufacturing, papers, it was a kind of bureaucratic hiding resistance rather than a massive uprising as there was in Warsaw. It's very little known, but it was extensive, and they were running smuggling lines where they would bring people in from Poland, get them to Hungary, then get them down to the Romanian border, because by then Romania had changed sides, and then some of them even made it onto Turkey and onto Palestine. So there's a very little known story about that. A lot of very young people as well. So that was fascinating for me also. But I mean, one of the things that I still wonder about is, why are we still so interested in the Second World War? What is it about the war? It was 80 years ago it ends. I've written a book about it. You've all written books about it. I mean, why? Why do you think that is, Anne? I mean, you're dealing with the most extreme, darkest aspect of it.
It was an existential battle. I think one of the things that might change is, I grew up, I'm a baby boomer, in an era where it was binary. We were fighting good against evil. It was very clear cut, and many of our parents were involved. I think that might change. It is changing already. People are looking differently at Churchill as a war leader, and looking differently at the results and the peace that we made. But of course we're completely fascinated by it, and there are constantly new ways of looking at it. I think one of the questions why I'm so intrigued is because it has been largely seen as a military, diplomatic, political war, but increasingly, as you've all said, the role of women is
Yes.
being looked at. And
Yes.
so there are new stories all the time, women as spies, women as resistors, as you say, women in France who were, it was a completely one-dimensional story. The women in France didn't want to talk about what they'd done, but actually as you look at the nuances of this story, they were delivering political tact. They were hiding, evading airmen. And there was much more resistance even in Auschwitz itself. You know, the one big uprising on October the 7th, 1944, when the Sonderkommando, this awful squad that had to take the bodies out of the gas chambers and then burn them, how were they able to resist at all? Because of the women in the munitions factory, the women who went out to work, who had to march to the orchestra, but they sent small amounts of powder for the uprising to take place, and these women, I mean, there were probably several of them involved in the uprising, but that hasn't really been talked about as an issue, because you think, well, if you're in Auschwitz, you can't resist at all. But I think there is so much about women. They signed the Official Secrets Act,
Yes.
and so Bletchley
And they
wasn't
wouldn't
talked
speak.
about
Yeah.
for years and years, and finally they are. If you compare women in Germany, for example, they were told to stay at home and create babies. So arguably, if more women in Germany were under arms or working and not doing
Domestic stuff.
all of that, there might have been a different approach. So I think as we reinterpret World War II, and you know, I haven't even begun on climate change and the atomic bomb, but there are just so many different
So many
ways
aspects.
to see it.
Yeah.
And here is this war that many of us here, I suspect, were born in the wake of it, with our parents involved, and it was absolutely an existential war. So
Absolutely, yeah. Tim, what do you think of the appeal
Well,
is?
I think
I mean, you've chosen as a historian to focus on this period, haven't you? So
I have. Maybe not a wise decision. It's
a
a crowded
very wise
market.
decision.
It's
When
a
we look at
crowded
your
market.
books, it's a very wise decision.
But I think Anne is right. One of the reasons we're so fascinated by this period is it appeared to us, it's represented in most films, and film has played a big part in the popularity of the Second World War, and it appeared to most of the Allied combatants that it was an existential struggle of good versus evil. But at the very highest level, there were major moral concerns and major political concerns which said this story is not so straightforward. The only way that the war could be ended by 1945, I'm not saying it could never have ended, but the only way it could have been ended in that time frame was by the democratic West allying with Stalinist Russia, a regime which had killed many, many millions of more people than the German regime had done before the outbreak of the Second World War, and consigning most of Eastern Europe and quite a lot of Far East Asia into what the Owen O'Malley, the diplomat you mentioned earlier, who later became British ambassador to the Polish government in exile, what he called a cultural gas chamber. He said, he wrote to Churchill and to Eden, he said, you are consigning Eastern Europe to a cultural gas chamber. When Stalin invades neutral Finland in November of 1944, Evelyn Waugh writes, through his alias Guy Crouchback in the Sword of Honor trilogy, at last the great monster was revealed. This, people said at the time, who detested communism and realized that communism and fascism were different sides of the same ideological coin, was what we should be fighting, and that we could no way claim to have a moral superiority if we were not fighting Stalin and fighting the Russians at the same time. And it took a huge amount of pragmatism for people to say, well, we actually do have to choose which is a greater threat to our way of life, which is a greater threat to Europe. And I think even in a utilitarian way, one could say that a cultural gas chamber, and there obviously were killings in the Eastern Bloc, was better than an actual gas chamber. And the fact that the Red Army did come in and behaved appallingly, raped millions of women, executed hundreds of thousands of others, nevertheless, the fact that there were any Jews left in Eastern Europe by 1945, does owe something to this vast, murderous regime. So those moral choices, I think, can be complicated, and are more complicated than they're often presented, and that's one of the reasons I thought that I could try and add to an already considerable literature.
And you have. Thank you. Jonathan.
Well, I think my view sort of builds on that, really, which is it's quite true that we have now seen that this is more complicated than we perhaps initially understood, or the sort of the movies showed us, in the sense that I think the previous version, the sort of Hollywood version, was that, well, Germany was entirely evil, and then everyone who fought Germany was uncomplicatedly good. And neither half of that is completely right, because there are all the kind of moral complexities that Tim has just referred to, but equally there were some people in Germany who were obviously not just evil, so that's more complicated. But despite that, Nazism itself is as Manichaeanly evil as you could ever imagine. And
yes.
You both used the word absolutely. There's something absolute about the evil of Nazism. And that, therefore, gives a kind of a moral core to all of these stories. You understand what's at stake. You understand the motives of the people involved. You know that something very ultimate is on the line. And I think as a result of that, everything is interesting about that. Once you've decided that this was an absolute evil that could have spelled the end of sort of humanity as we understand it, or civilization, then everything is interesting, every act of resistance possible. So Anne was mentioning about the women. It just, you know, memory pops back into my head. I mentioned this woman who is the founding head mistress of a girls' school. At first, there's very little she can do by way of resistance, but she does what she can. So, for example, you know, there was a rule then that every school must display a portrait of Hitler. That quietly comes down. She doesn't display it. The girls don't do the Hitler salute. And I only know all this because a Gestapo inspector was sent to the school and noticed these deviations from orthodoxy.
Which are brave acts.
Say again?
They're brave acts.
These are brave acts. Each one of them is a brave act, but they're tiny little acts of resistance. So at one point, as part of the kind of total war effort, the girls are tasked with, the school is asked to make sure all the pupils, the girls at the school, darn socks of Germans at the front, and they do a kind of go slow, where they do a few, but they keep a couple of holes in, they don't produce as many as they're meant to, just these little acts of defiance. Now, in another context, we might just think, who's interested in darning socks? But in this context, suddenly that becomes fascinating.
So that has overlap with, or resonance with, when you read these stories of prisoners in the camps, because many of the camps had work camps attached to them where they were making arms or musicians. Yes. You know, they would make sure that the shell didn't fire, or they'd mess up the powder.
That's right. There were acts of sabotage going on all the time.
Mini, tiny acts of sabotage, even if they weren't in themselves going to affect the outcome of very much, at least they gave them a sense that they could do something.
And just bit by bit, it would have done something. Yeah. I was just going to add one last thing there as well about why we get back to this. I think it's because all of these moral big picture things, but the other point is so basic, but people wrote things down. Yeah. I mean, Tim has mentioned that one-line record that he found. It is just a sort of sweet spot in terms of the technology. You know, now people are saying things on WhatsApp and disappearing messages, and I do not know what the historians of the future are going to do with that. But then it's minuted, it's paper, it's records, and we can know. For this book, I was able to go into diaries and letters and court transcripts, and they're on paper.
And it's there. Anne.
Well, I just want to say, first of all, what we're all saying is that cumulatively, these acts are really important, but there's something that goes beyond that. It helped them with their soul of surviving. And I think one of the reasons why we can't shed ourselves of the after effect of World War II is the generational trauma. And I don't just mean people who are survivors, but I think for everyone who was deprived, everyone who was involved in this fight. The war didn't end in 1945. I mean, one of the shocks for me was finding that Belsen was still there until 1950. Where did these people go? But there are so many stories like that, that when I say survivors, I don't just mean camp survivors, people who lived through the war were unable to tell their children. They wanted to bring their children up with normality, not to discuss it. I've found endless stories that I love interviewing women in their 80s and 90s because finally they actually want to make sense of their life. So in order to make sense of your life and tell the story and believe that you've lived for some purpose, actually having done something useful is important for your soul to live with some moral clarity that it wasn't all in vain.
Thank you. We will go to questions in a minute. I just want to ask Tim quickly, talking about this moral clarity and moral ambiguity, how do you think leaders like Roosevelt and Churchill, what did they think when they looked in the morning and they thought, Eastern Europe's gone, I've given this to Stalin, I had to do it, it's in the greater good? I mean, can you get, or did you get into their heads at all about how they were coping with these incredible compromises that they had to make for a greater good?
This goes very against the modern trend of knocking Churchill for everything and just thinking of him being an imperialist and judging him on his moral actions with regard.
We're not doing that. We're not doing that here today.
No, I know we're not. So I'm just saying what I'm about to, getting there. My preamble is that most of what Churchill does in the Second World War, he is looking at with a moral lens, and it eats at him. At Yalta, he's looking out at the Black Sea, and it's a beautiful sunny day, and his daughter remarks on the gulls which are diving down and hitting the water and says how beautiful it is, and he says, the river of Hades. He's seeing death. He says after the Tehran conference, there is going to be another worse conflict in the future with the instruments of modern science, and there's morality eating away at him at what he can't do, and this leads him to do some very pragmatic things which he's been criticized for a huge amount. In October of 1944, he rushes to Moscow to deal with Stalin because he sees the Red Army coming into the Balkans, and he makes what I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with is this percentages agreement, whereby he negotiates the percentages of influence that the British Empire and the Soviets are going to have in the Balkans, and Hungary is going to be 50-50 between the two. Yugoslavia will be 50-50. Bulgaria will be 90% Soviet, Greece will be 90% British. It's done in a few minutes, it's incredibly cynical, none of these countries involved are in any way consulted. Churchill is embarrassed by this, and yet what he was doing was sacrificing what had already been lost, which was Yugoslavia, which had been taken over by Tito and the communists, Romania, which the Red Army was already in, Hungary, which the Red Army was about to go into, in order to save what little remained, and that was Greece. And when the first stage of the Greek Civil War began in the winter of 1944-1945, Stalin did not support the Greek partisans who were fighting British troops. And when the Greek Civil War even reignited again in the beginning part of the Cold War, Stalin adhered to a large extent to the percentages agreement. So even when he's at his most cynical, Churchill believes he is acting in a fairly moral way, whereas the frivolity of Franklin Roosevelt at Yalta, at Tehran, the records of what he said in his rooms, which were all bugged by the Soviets, Stalin thought that Roosevelt was giving out deliberate misinformation because he was being so rude about Churchill and the British in his room. He thought that this was all a deceit for him. He treated high-stakes politics and high questions of morality with an extraordinary frivolity.
Right. Thank you. Well, thank you to all of our three authors for amazing insights and really, really very interesting discussion. Let's throw it open now to questions. We have 12 minutes or so we can have a couple of questions. Gentleman in the front, over here. People pass the microphone along, please. If there's anyone in particular you'd like to address your question to.
Just to all of you, really. I wanted to ask whether you felt that 80 years was long enough for us to really understand the Second World War, given the context of emerging wars with Russia and Ukraine and China potentially in the next few years. Is it over, or was it the Second World War, then the Cold War, and then the next one that's going to start?
That's a great question. So you're saying that what's going on now, is that still a continuation?
Did it actually finish in 45?
Yeah, did it finish in 45? let's keep our answers shortish so we can get a few more questions in. Jonathan, did it finish in 45?
Well, it's a very arresting thought.
It's a very good question.
Before us,
Yeah.
I mean, that idea, look, on some level, obviously it did, again, because of the point I made before about the defeat of Nazism. That is absolutely a moment. And you can see the construction of the post-war international order that we speak about. That's obviously a real break with everything that's gone before. I mean, the point I would make, it's slightly coming off of your question, but you look at where we are now, right in the world at this moment, and you look at the breakdown of the international order, you look at the departure from those norms, which a lot of people, if we're talking about things that surprised us, a lot of people, me included, thought were locked in, just in terms of even the kind of ultra-militant nationalism in Europe and so on, not just Europe, that we thought were things that we thought were behind us. The rather glum conclusion I'm coming to more and more is it seems to me a lot of the lessons we learned about authoritarianism and cults of personality and sort of rampant nationalism, a lot of those things, it seems to me, rather than being locked into the sort of human consciousness for forever, did instead last about the length of a human lifespan. And that is a sort of grim thought that just as the last survivors and so on are, some of them in their 90s, even 100 years old, at that very moment you see a whole lot of the kind of lessons we thought we had learned being discarded. Sometimes being discarded, you talk about frivolity, but with a kind of gleefully, and knowingly. I mean, you see some of I was bound to say this, but I'm watching, obviously, the Trump administration in the United States and reveling in the kinds of behavior that previous generations would have thought, well, that gets a bit uncomfortably close to you-know-what. So we're not going to have people snatching people off the streets wearing masks. We won't do that. And I hadn't realized that these lessons, in a way, were time limited to the length of a human life. And I do worry that we're seeing, so in that sense, there's a continuity.
Tim?
I completely agree with everything that Jonathan has said, and I think that people did, particularly the United States, learn the lessons of what had gone wrong in the 30s. Isolationism didn't work. It didn't even protect Americans. Americans entered the war because they were attacked by the Japanese on the 7th of December 1941. Allies are infuriating. Multinational organizations are often sclerotic and therefore infuriating. But they are our best chance of living in a world without wars, and that was assumed. And American withdrawal from the world following the First World War, and failure to join the League of Nations, failure to help the Europeans contain Nazism, was recognized in the US as being a huge mistake. And this led, before you get into the mire of Vietnam and things, to a series of highly successful period of American leadership, the birth of NATO, the World Bank, economic structures, multilateral organizations, and the successful containment of Russian expansion. And that has now gone, obviously, in a completely reverse direction, and the glee with which Jonathan refers is very disquieting. And I just keep on coming back to a line that Winston Churchill repeated on at least 3 occasions during the Second World War, and I think pertains to today as much as it did then, which is that there's only one thing worse than fighting with allies, and that's fighting without allies. And I think we're in great danger of forgetting that.
Yeah. Anne?
I agree. 80 years is a convenient point because people will die out, and they are dying out, so that's when we commemorate it. But we're historians. If you take a long historical lens, I hate to be so depressing, but look at the demise of the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Empires do rise and fall, and there's no automatic given that we should have democracy, imperfect as it is. So, and the only other thing I've learned from this book on the women's orchestra, they ended up in Belsen. They didn't want to go back, or they couldn't go back to Poland or Germany. Their houses were destroyed, their livelihoods taken from them. There were quotas for Australia, America, Canada, Britain. Where the hell could many of these people go? They were DPs, they had no means of earning a living, no family. they were not necessarily Zionists. Many of them were not. And so we do see this tangled line of the world we're living in. And it's not a straight line, it's not a direct line, but certainly 80 years is long enough for these conflicts to rear ugly heads.
Thank you. Well, I think we've got time for one more question. Gentleman here. Yeah, yeah.
I'm sorry, my questions were...
Or it maybe more than one if it's directed just to one of our esteemed panel.
I apologize. It's just,
And it can keep the answers short. We might be able to get one more in afterwards.
Of these three leaders, you know, all coming from very different cultures, backgrounds, countries, governments. In your opinion, what do you feel like were the greatest strengths that each of them brought to the table to lead this allied effort, like on that personal level of leadership?
That's a huge question, worthy of
We
a
don't
book.
have
We don't have time, but I will give you.
Unfortunately.
What did everyone do? Churchill and the British people, their greatest act was to prevent Hitler from winning. It wasn't making the Allies win, it was denying Hitler victory in the summer of 1940, to hold the fort before the Americans came in and the Soviets came in. What's the Americans' greatest contribution? It is, frankly, being the arsenal for democracy, paying for the war, lending it to the British, giving it to the Soviets. Britain finished paying back her debts to the Americans in 2006 for the Second World War. And the Red Army, in part because of Stalin's blunders, but in part because of the utter ferocity of the war on the East, paid the blood price to defeat the Wehrmacht by 1945. With America in the war, I think the Nazis could have been defeated, particularly with the successful development of the atomic bomb, and it would have absolutely been used on the Germans if the Germans had still been in the war at the time it was tested. But without the Soviet contribution, the war would have gone on for a lot longer, and we wouldn't be talking about Western Allied casualties in the hundreds of thousands, but in the millions.
Yeah. I think we've got time for one more. Anyone at the back or in the middle? Because we've had a couple from the front. Good question. Okay, then anyone at the front? Gentleman here? Yeah.
Just very quickly, as far as I know, the help from the US to Britain during the Second World War and actually in any other situation has usually been minimal and come at a very high financial cost. And yet in this country we often hear about the special relationship. Do you think there's a special relationship?
How special was that special relationship when we had to pay so much and didn't stop paying until 2006? Extraordinary fact there.
Yeah.
The special relationship was special. The Anglo-American alliance was the most sophisticated, collegiate, and successful military alliance in history. It rid the Germans from the North African coast, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, and Western Europe. But it was always unequal, and a consistent US war aim was capturing British trade and dismantling the empire. And one of the reasons for Churchill using the phrase special relationship was to try and appeal to American emotions and a sense of kinship that the mother country, the English-speaking peoples of the old world, would have to be bailed out by the new world, which to a certain extent they were, but only after, as John Maynard Keynes said, we had suffered our own financial Dunkirk in 1945, when all American credit stopped with the end of the war. Taps were later turned back on a bit and led to a period of very, very tough austerity in this country and very swift decolonization.
I always smile when I hear the phrase special relationship because I used to be a correspondent.
I was just going to say, Jonathan, jump in.
I was a correspondent in Washington, and there was the only time you would always get told, you know, when there's either the president is visiting Britain or prime minister is visiting Washington, you know, can we have a story on the special relationship? And you'd have to sort of break hearts back in London by saying, nobody here ever uses that phrase, you say, from Washington. It's a completely unrequited love affair, I'm afraid. We always say it's a special relationship. If you hear an American president use the phrase special relationship about the connection with Britain, it's because one of their aides has said to them, listen, they've got this neurosis about the phrase. Please just write in that phrase somewhere so that, you know, Britain can take a sort of deep breath. So no, there is something. There's a little bit of pathos. It's a tiny bit pathetic. The way we hunger and need for that phrase. It isn't how they see it. And funnily enough, since we're talking about this, I many times, and didn't want to necessarily disappoint Guardian readers by telling them this, you would hear an American president say it when the visiting German chancellor was there. They would say there's a special relationship with Germany.
No, say it's not so.
Say it's not so. So yes, it's one of those things. We need it, but it's not natural. It's not natural for
Our
them.
hearts are being broken in the
I'm afraid so.
DC again. Thank you very much to our panel. Really a wonderful contribution.
Thank you.